There's a location in the Western Sahara Desert of Mauritania called the Richat structure. It's also commonly referred to as the Eye of the Sahara,
where there's clear evidence of water erosion that took place after the volcano. There's so much that points to that possibly being Atlantis.
When we think of the Sahara Desert, we imagine a vast, sun-scorched sea of sand dunes stretching endlessly in every direction. A hostile, arid expanse larger than the entire continental United States. But what if we told you the world's largest non-polar desert holds far more than just sand and heat? Has it always been a barren wasteland, or is there a deeper story buried beneath the dunes? From a recent episode of one of the world's most popular podcasts, we bring you the unsolved mysteries of the Sahara. The Eye of the Sahara and the Lost City of Atlantis. Joe Rogan recently had two fascinating guests on his podcast, and what they talked about might just blow your mind. He sat down with Jimmy Corsetti and Ben Van Kerkwijk, two independent researchers who are deep into exploring ancient mysteries and forgotten history. Their conversation took a wild turn when they brought up something truly amazing. What if the legendary lost city of Atlantis is not under the sea, but right in the middle of one of the driest, most unlikely places on Earth, the Sahara Desert? According to them, there's a strange natural formation in the Western Sahara called the Richat structure that might just fit Plato's ancient description of Atlantis. A lot of people call it the Eye of the Sahara because of how it looks from above. What's crazy is that this place looks a lot like what Plato wrote about when he described Atlantis a long time ago. Jimmy said the Richat structure fits more than 12 big details that Plato talked about. Things like the circle-shaped design, the huge size, and where it sits compared to the sea and some mountains nearby. Even though the place seems to check all the boxes, scientists haven't really studied it much, and most people still don't know it exists. Joe even admitted that he had never heard of it until he saw one of Jimmy's videos. What's really strange is how such a huge and one-of-a-kind place in nature has stayed mostly unknown for such a long time, especially since it probably should be considered one of the natural wonders of the world. Scientists still do not fully get how it was formed, and the fact that hardly anyone knows about it just makes the whole thing feel even more mysterious. While digging into the story of Atlantis, Jimmy found out about a guy from way back in history named Pomponius Mela. He lived around 2,000 years ago and was known as the first Roman geographer. He put together a map called The Habitable World of Pomponius Mela, and what really makes it interesting is that he actually pointed out the Western Sahara area on it, which is the exact same place where the Richat structure sits. What makes this stand out even more is that the Romans were really serious when it came to writing things down carefully. So if Mela included that part of the desert on his map, it probably means that the place was already seen as important way back then. Jimmy had spent years looking into old maps and ideas about Atlantis, but he had never heard of this map until recently. Now, it is also important not to mix up Mela's map with another old map that people often bring up when talking about Atlantis, the one they say came from Herodotus. Herodotus was a Greek historian from around 2,500 years ago, and some folks think he drew a map showing Atlantis near the Richat structure too. But many modern-day experts are not sure Herodotus ever actually drew that map, which makes the whole thing kind of uncertain. Even though there is still a lot of debate around the map connected to Herodotus, the one made by Pomponius Mela is a real piece of history. This makes the idea stronger that ancient people might have known more about this part of the world than we usually give them credit for. Another cool thing is that Mela's original map was drawn facing the east, which was a normal way to make maps back then. But when you turn it around to fit how we see maps today, with the top being north and the bottom being south, it is easy to spot places like Europe, West Asia, and North Africa. Then in the top left corner of the Sahara Desert, right where the Richat structure is today, there is something really interesting written on it, the name Atlantia, or Atlantier. This name seems to point to the people of Atlantis, and it is placed exactly where the Richat is located today. Now this is where it gets even more exciting. Jimmy noticed that when Plato described Atlantis, he included very specific things, like how the city in the middle had rings, 3 made of water and 2 made of land. That is exactly the kind of pattern you see in the Risha. But it is not just about how it looks. Jimmy said, and plans to prove later, that there is solid science showing that the Risha once held water. One big detail is how the southern side of the Risha has a clear break, which lines up with Plato's story of a southern opening to the sea. Parallels in geology and ancient resources. Plato once described Atlantis as a city that sat beside a giant flat plain shaped like a rectangle. If you look at satellite images of the area around the Rishat structure, you will see something very similar. There is a huge flat piece of land stretching out for hundreds of miles, right next to it. And get this, Plato also talked about Atlantis having red, black, and white stones. That exact mix of colors can be found in the rocks around the Risha too, which is kind of weird when you think about it. But that is not all. Jimmy found something else that adds to the mystery. He came across an old English book from the year 1851 that talks about ancient Mauritania, the region where the Risha is found. This book says that Mauritania was packed with gold. In fact, it even mentions that before people in Europe found the Americas, they were getting a lot of their gold from this very part of Africa. Somehow, most people today have never heard about this. Back then, this same place was part of the Mali Empire, ruled by a man named Mansa Musa. He is still known as the richest person in all of recorded history. He had so much gold that people say his mines in this area may have provided more than half of the gold used across the world at the time. Plato also said that Atlantis was full of wealth and riches, so the similarities are kind of hard to ignore. Believe it or not, that same book from the year 1851 also talked about Mauritania being full of elephant ivory. That is a big deal, because Plato mentioned elephants living in Atlantis as part of its natural environment. And here is the wild part. Near the Rishat structure, there are ancient cave drawings that clearly show elephants. These are not just random shapes either. They really do look like elephants, drawn in the right place and backed up by both written history and what has been found by archaeologists. Now, one of the biggest reasons people say the Risha cannot be Atlantis is because of how it looks today. The place is dry, dusty, and super hot. Critics say Atlantis was supposed to be green and full of life, with warm and cool springs right in the middle of the city. But then Jimmy found a lesser-known report from the late 1990s that totally surprised him. It said the Rishat structure was once a hydrothermal complex. That basically means it used to have underground heat that created hot springs. This detail really matters. Hot springs are one of the key signs of hydrothermal areas, and if the Rishat once had both hot and cold springs like Plato described, then the dry desert we see now does not actually rule it out. Scientists believe that around 11,000 to 12,000 years ago, which matches the time Atlantis was said to have been destroyed, this region looked completely different. Back then, it may have had lots of water, plants, and life, which makes the whole idea of Atlantis being in the Sahara a lot more believable. Mountains, rivers, and the name Atlas. Plato once wrote that Atlantis had huge mountains to the north. If the tall cliffs of the Adrar Highlands are not convincing enough, then there is something even more massive right nearby, the Atlas Mountains. These mountains sit directly north of the Rishat structure. But here is the weird part. The Atlas Mountains were named after a man called Atlas, who was the first known king of Mauritania. That just so happens to be the exact same name Plato gave to the first king of Atlantis. Is it just a random connection? Maybe, but it is definitely one that makes you stop and think. And it does not stop there. Plato also said that Atlantis had rivers running through it. Well, modern science has found something interesting. There used to be an ancient river called the Tamanrasset. It started in the Atlas Mountains and flowed all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And guess what? It passed right through the area where the Rishat structure is today. Scientists say this river was flowing around 11,700 years ago, which lines up perfectly with the time Plato said Atlantis was wiped out. That is not just close, it is an exact match. Back then, the Sahara was not dry and dusty like it is now. It was green, full of plants, and rich with water. When scientists looked at satellite images of the Sahara Desert, they found huge patterns carved into the land. But this was not just wind doing its thing. According to people like Randall Carlson, who is known for studying big natural disasters, these deep grooves were made by massive amounts of water. You can clearly see the markings, and they stretch from the Rishaw structure all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It looks like something powerful tore through the land. Some experts now think that long ago, a giant wave of water may have rushed down from the Mediterranean Sea, sweeping across North Africa. If you trace where that water would have gone, it follows the lowest parts of the land. And guess what? It leads right through the Rishaw area. That brings us to one of the most surprising things found so far. Just off the coast of Mauritania, scientists discovered something huge under the sea called the Mauritanian Slide. It was a giant underwater landslide, and it happened around 11,000 years ago, which matches the time Atlantis was said to be destroyed. Experts believe this slide was caused by a tsunami. When they checked the direction the debris moved, it showed the wave came from the east and crashed into the coast in front of the Rishaw. This is not just a theory. The debris field is massive. Based on the research, it stretches more than 300 kilometers from side to side, which is nearly 200 miles, and goes about 150 kilometers top to bottom. That means it is even wider than the whole state of Florida and covers about the same distance as driving from New York City to Washington, D.C. So, if the Rishaw structure really was the place called Atlantis, then this tsunami might be what wiped it out. The debris lines up right in front of where the Rishaw opens to the ocean, and below that area is a mile-thick layer of untouched material. Jimmy thinks this place should be checked with LiDAR and also drilled into, because there could be ancient remains buried there waiting to be found. The Rishaw salt, mollusks, and more proof. But wait, there is still more to think about. People say Atlantis sank under the sea, right? But scientists say the Sahara Desert has not been underwater since something called the Trans-Saharan Seaway. That was between 56 and 66 million years ago, way back when dinosaurs were still around. And even then, the water in that seaway flowed toward the south, not toward the west, which means it never even got close to where the Rishaw is now. So here is where things get interesting. If the Rishaw structure really was flooded, it could not have been because of that ancient seaway. That means something else happened, something newer, and not fully explained yet. Now here comes the real shocker. There is a volcano called Koussi, and it is the tallest one in the Sahara, standing over 11,000 feet high. It is no longer active and is called a stratovolcano. Scientists believe it formed around 2 million years ago. But the big surprise is that the last time lava flowed from Koussi was at the southern edge of the crater, and that happened about 12,000 years ago. That is the same time many people think Atlantis was destroyed and when the Mauritanian Slide occurred. This volcano almost acts like a time marker, showing that something big and possibly dangerous was going on in that part of the world at the same time Atlantis was said to disappear. Let us go back to Koussi for a second. That lava flow from about 12,000 years ago is still visible today. But if you take a close look, you will see that the lava has been cut through by the same powerful water erosion found near the Rishaw. That means the flood had to happen after the lava came out, not before it. So, whether the volcano erupted 12,000 years ago or 2 million years ago, this proves that huge amounts of water moved through the Sahara more recently than what most experts have been saying. Now, let's take a look inside the volcano's caldera, which sits over 11,000 feet above sea level. That white patch you see? It's not snow, it's salt, the leftover remnants of an ancient lake that dried up just a few thousand years ago. And here's something even more interesting. Tiny aquatic creatures, like snails, slugs, and limpets, have been found in that caldera. Scientists used radiocarbon dating to figure out that these creatures lived around 14,000 to 15,000 years ago. So, how did saltwater and aquatic creatures end up in a volcano crater that high up? The answer is pretty straightforward. It happened after the volcano erupted, not before. This suggests that a huge wave of saltwater rushed through the Sahara after the volcanic events, and this fits perfectly with the time when Atlantis is believed to have been destroyed. Now, back at the Rishat structure, you'll spot similar white patches around the edges, both inside and outside. These aren't just regular mineral deposits, they are salt. And Mauritania still exports salt today. The places around the Rishat with the highest salt levels are also the lowest in elevation, which means seawater probably collected there, then evaporated. In a lesser-known but reliable scientific study, researchers found aquatic life, including mollusks, right inside the Rishat structure. These weren't just any mollusks either. Species like clams, oysters, and mussels, which all need saltwater or brackish water to live. Even more surprising, these mollusks were radiocarbon dated to a period between 15,000 and 7,700 years ago, which lines up perfectly with the timeline when Atlantis was supposed to have existed and been destroyed, around 11,600 years ago. An empire lost in translation. Places like the Canary Islands, Madeira, and even the submerged Azores could very well be the broken pieces of a once great civilization from the Atlantic. Here's something else to consider. Some people argue that the Rishat can't be Atlantis because it's a natural formation. But throughout history, humans have always built on the most impressive natural features: mountains, valleys, craters. Also, the idea that Atlantis was created by Poseidon, the god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses, doesn't really contradict this. The Greek name for Poseidon translates to husband of the earth, which sounds a lot like a poetic way of referring to Mother Nature. There's also this common belief that Plato said Atlantis was west of the Pillars of Hercules, which we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, so it must be somewhere deep in the Atlantic. But that's not what Plato actually wrote. The word he used means in front of. If you sail out of the strait, the ocean current actually takes you south, directly toward the Rishat. In fact, you'd have three choices: sail along the European coast, follow the African coast, or head straight into the unknown, which must have been a scary option. It's easy to imagine ancient sailors picking the safer coastal route, leading them straight to Mauritania. Here's another big mix-up. Plato said Atlantis sank beneath the waves, so a lot of people think it must be at the bottom of the ocean. But Plato also mentioned that the area where Atlantis used to be became impossible for ships to pass through because it was filled with reeds and mud. That doesn't sound like an ocean trench. It sounds more like a salt marsh or a shallow floodplain, all clogged up with sediment and still water. Even though the Rishat structure is now 1,200 feet above sea level, the presence of mollusks and salt water in its rings, dating back to the exact time when Atlantis was supposed to have been destroyed, shows that it was once underwater. So, what happened? This is where isostatic rebound comes in, the science behind how land rises or sinks after huge ice sheets melt. When the glaciers in North America melted at the end of the last ice age, the land lightened up and started to rise. But Earth doesn't just let one area rise without affecting others. If one place goes up, another usually sinks. That could explain why the Azores are sunken, and possibly why the Rishat rose. What makes this even more interesting is that the opposite side of the Earth from the Rishat, called its antipode, is Zealandia, a newly discovered sunken continent. Is this just a coincidence? Maybe. But it adds another piece to the puzzle that global forces might have reshaped the land, and in the process, maybe even swallowed an ancient civilization. Buried civilizations in the Sahara. Within the same podcast episode, Ben disclosed uncovered evidence of burial sites and ruins that belong to ancient civilizations, civilizations that history seems to have forgotten. These aren't just random structures. They're part of a bigger puzzle that's only now starting to come to light from under the sand. But here's where it gets interesting. When we talk about these civilizations being thousands of years old, we're not talking about ancient history the way we usually think of it. New scientific findings show that the Sahara Desert, which was once thought to have been dry for millions of years, is actually much younger than we thought. As recently as 5,000 years ago, this area wasn't a desert at all. It was a lush, green paradise stretching from Egypt to the Atlantic, filled with rivers and freshwater lakes, some of the biggest ever known on Earth. And here's the really wild part. This change didn't take thousands of years. Satellite images and sediment studies show that this tropical landscape disappeared in as little as 100 years. Just 1 century. Some researchers think it might have taken closer to 500 years. But either way, that's a shockingly fast change. So what caused this sudden shift? Scientists at MIT believe it's connected to a 20,000-year climate cycle caused by changes in the Earth's tilt. According to their model, the Sahara naturally switches between desert and jungle every few thousand years. The last switch, they say, happened about 5,000 years ago. Other estimates range from 4,500 to 11,000 years ago, but it's that 11,000-year mark that stands out. 11,000 years ago lines up with the Younger Dryas, a strange climate disaster that might have wiped out ecosystems and human settlements all over the world. New research suggests that what happened in the Sahara might be connected to other major global disasters. This also brings up a question about a theory mentioned in declassified CIA files that talk about the Earth's magnetic poles flipping every 6,500 years, which could temporarily change the way the planet is oriented. Whether or not this theory is true, it's clear that whatever happened in North Africa had a huge and immediate impact on the environment and the people living there. This brings us to ancient Egypt. Egypt isn't just near the Sahara, it's actually in the Sahara. It also has the highest number of ancient ruins on Earth, many of which date back to the same time as the last major change in the Sahara. The first dynasty of Egypt is believed to have started just over 5,000 years ago, and the first pyramid was built around the same time. Could this be just a coincidence? And we can't ignore the Great Sphinx of Giza. Geological signs of rainfall erosion around the Sphinx show that it's much older than the 4,500-year estimate we've been taught. The last time that area had heavy rainfall was over 7,000 years ago, right when the Sahara was still a green and thriving place. Now, if you think about it, most of Egypt's ancient monuments were built near the Nile River. This makes sense because civilizations tend to settle near water. But what if the Nile didn't always flow north like it does now? The Sahara's hidden secrets. Here's something pretty cool. The place where Herodotus said the Nile began is almost exactly where modern-day Mauritania is, in the Western Sahara. In 2015, scientists found a huge network of ancient rivers that had dried up, and guess what? Those rivers were dated to about 5,000 years ago, which is around the same time that studies showed the Sahara was once green. Even more surprising, this discovery happened completely separately from those earlier studies. Different research teams, working on totally different things, ended up with nearly the same conclusions. Ben also mentioned in the podcast how incredible it is that these unrelated discoveries from various parts of the scientific community all point to that same key moment in history. And it gets even more interesting. They found more than one river system. At least 3 big networks have been identified, and they all date back to that same time period. Experts believe these rivers helped with human migration, much like how the Nile helped the Egyptians. Jimmy came across a study that supports this idea, showing that these rivers were real and would have been important for people moving around, settling, and surviving in the Sahara. Take a look at the newest map of these river systems and compare it to the one Herodotus described. His map shows a Nile that runs from west to east, then turns north, kind of like the ancient rivers that were just uncovered. Ben mentioned in the podcast how striking it is that Herodotus described this so many years before modern science found these rivers. Before the Sahara became the dry desert we see today, it was full of rivers and lakes. Then something sudden happened and buried it all under sand. Egypt went through something similar when explorers rediscovered it. Many of its ancient structures were completely buried, and for a long time, no one even knew they were there. The people who built them? Gone. Erased from history. Now here's the weird part. There are no hieroglyphs or petroglyphs that show the pyramids being built. None at all. Not one. Just that missing detail alone should make you wonder. And the modern Egyptian language? It's totally different from what the ancient Egyptians spoke. Everything we know about their writing came from decoding the Rosetta Stone. Without that, we'd have no idea. Experts believe this gap in history might point to an even older civilization, one that came long before the dynasties we recognize. Ben even suggested in the episode that this could be proof of two completely different civilizations, separated by the fall of the Green Sahara. Here's a crazy idea. What if the collapse of the Sahara did exactly that, cut off one civilization from the next? Just think about all the destruction. Huge statues toppled, pyramids broken beyond repair. And no, copper hammers didn't do that. Let's be honest here. But for a second, imagine this. The Sahara used to look more like the Amazon rainforest than the barren desert it is today. That's what scientists are starting to believe. It's a complete shift in how we see things, and one we really need to consider if we want to understand what happened before us. Now, let's talk about those ancient lakes. The biggest one of all, Lake Chad. When it was at its peak, it covered nearly 140,000 square miles. That's more space than all 5 Great Lakes combined. In 2010, researchers uncovered another massive lake, one that stretched over 42,000 square miles at its biggest. Today, though, it's just an empty space filled with wind, dust, and silence. The Sahara has a way of wiping everything out. This map shows the lakes we've discovered so far, leftovers from 9,000 years ago up until today. And again, they all dried up around 5,000 years ago, just like the rivers. Different research, different scientists, but the same conclusion. All of this gives us the image of a lost paradise, swallowed by time, heat, and endless sand. But here's the thing, we're only just starting to grasp how much is buried out there. The discoveries are coming in quicker now, thanks to tools like drones, satellite imagery, and what scientists are calling archaeology from space. Using ground-penetrating radar, which has been around since the 1990s, researchers can spot structures buried several meters deep under the earth. And now, it's better than ever. In just the last few years, they've uncovered surprising ruins all across the Sahara, stretching from Libya to Mauritania. For example, in Libya, just west of Egypt, researchers recently found castle-like structures with walls that stand over 13 feet tall and complex irrigation systems. And in the Western Sahara, hundreds of strange stone formations have popped up, scattered across remote areas, right on the surface, but nobody knows who built them, when they were made, or why. If this is what we can see on the surface, just imagine what's still hidden underneath. There are even more ruins spread across places like Algeria and Chad, some thought to be from the Romans, while others are still a complete mystery. And we're only just getting started. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.